Hi folks, Carrie here. Just a slight disclaimer before we start this week's show. I cocked up with the research and I said that the wife of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and the mother of Anne and Isabel was Cecily Neville. She wasn't. It was actually Anne de Beauchamp, the 16th Countess of Warwick. So, my fault, my bad. Please forgive me. And without further ado, here we go.
Hello, I'm Carrie.
And I'm Emily.
And we are the voices of Tarbis.
And what is Tarbis, we hear you cry?
Well, Tarbis is a blog that we set up about a year ago.
Yep.
To blog about historical places that we'd been to, giving them ratings and advising people to go there, really.
And to eat, because Tarbis stands for Time and Relative Blogging, including sandwiches.
Indeed. So we decided that we would expand a little bit on that and bring you some facts and figures about places, people, events, dynasties, things like that throughout the past as a podcast.
Yeah, and because we wanted to use different forms of media to geek out over history, because it's what we like to do best.
It is indeed, and we hope you enjoy listening to it. And if you want to get in touch, give us a review, suggest some things or people that you'd like us to talk about. Here's how you can do it.
On Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and WordPress. I'm saying them all because we all have one name. We are at Tarbis, in capitals, history.
Indeed, and we would love to hear from you. So, without further ado, here's Tarbis
After Hours. This week on Tarbis After Hours, we discuss a battle, or rather a series of battles, that forever changed the face of English history. They've got everything. Political intrigue, changing loyalties, family pitted against each other, the bloodiest battle on English soil, the breaking of sanctuary and the killing of kings. This week, we cover the War of the Roses, a set of battles covering a 50-year span that are worthy of any George R.R. Martin novel. In fact, it is said that A Song of Fire and Ice, or Game of Thrones, was in part inspired by this conflict. It saw the end of a dynasty that had ruled the land for over 300 years and set the stage for arguably the most iconic ruling family that this tiny island has produced, the Tudors. Spoilers, Carrie, they won. So, what exactly were the Wars of the Roses, and how did they start?
Well, I'm glad you asked. To understand this, we do need to go a bit further back. The Plantagenet family was originally a French line through the Counts of Anjou, originally known as the Angevins for this very reason. They weren't really destined for the throne until Matilda, a surviving daughter of the Norman king Henry I, married a Geoffrey Plantagenet. She was supposed to have been Queen of England after Henry died, but was usurped by her cousin Stephen in a period of history known as the Anarchy, but more on that later. Matilda gave birth to a son, Henry, who later became King Henry II of England in 1154, the first Plantagenet king. Now, Plantagenet was not the family name technically. It was more of a nickname that Geoffrey of Anjou got for the Plantagenista weed, which grows profusely. The family was quite fecund, meaning that they bred very well, like a weed. So they unofficially adopted this as their sigil and name. It wasn't actually used by the family until the 15th century when Richard, Duke of York, adopted it, possibly as a way to demonstrate his descent from Geoffrey and thereby Henry II. We'll explain why it was important for him to do this in a moment. The Plantagenet line continued uninterrupted for the next 200 or so years, and this is where the divide then comes in. King Edward III had many children, but we will only really focus on the main three: Edward, known as a Black Prince, Edmund, and John. Edward was the firstborn, and so was the heir to the throne. Edmund was therefore invested as Duke of York, and John, known as John of Gaunt, was made Duke of Lancaster. He also had another son, Lionel, who was made Duke of Clarence. This is where things do get a little bit complicated, so try and stay with us.
Lionel. I'm not going to lie, that doesn't strike me as the name of a king or a prince.
But he was once, twice, 3 times a royal.
Wow. That was completely off the cuff, everybody. We hadn't spoken of that at all.
Yeah, probably shouldn't have been.
Yeah, this is why we drink wine when we're making these podcasts, for little nuggets like that.
Exactly.
But anyway, back to being complicated, which is one word for it. So Lionel only had a daughter, Philippa. She then married an Edmund Mortimer, the 3rd Earl of March. He didn't last very long and was killed in Cork Island on the 27th of December 1381, aged only 29. Their son, Edmund Mortimer, and his future father-in-law,
Owen Glendower. Well done. You were going to do well. You were on a roll. I just thought I'd jump in.
No, it's just the name.
Owen Glendower. Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Would end up causing problems and trouble for a future king of England, and paid the price for it. Edward, the Black Prince, unfortunately died before his father did, so he never took the throne. This instead passed to his son, Richard II, his older son having died aged 6.
Okay.
John of Gaunt and Richard of York remained. However, to guide young Richard in his kingship...
Sorry, not Richard, Edmund. That was my fault. I put the wrong name in the notes. It's John of Gaunt and Edmund of York. That was my bad.
You literally had one job, Carrie.
Yeah, Richard comes later.
Yeah, exactly. You literally had one job.
Sorry.
Shame. Shame. Shame.
And the Game of Thrones references continue.
They do. So, I'm going to start that one again.
Mm-hmm.
So, Edward, the Black Prince, unfortunately died before his father did, so he never took the throne. This instead passed to his son, Richard II, his older son having died around age 6.
Yes.
John of Gaunt and Edmund of York remained, however, to guide young Richard in his kingship.
Mm-hmm.
This was until an altercation led the young king to banish John of Gaunt's son. Henry Bolingbroke, named after the castle where he was born, was banned from the kingdom. Henry was John's eldest legitimate son, but he also had an illegitimate line through a relationship with Catherine Swainwood. He later married her, but they had children before then. Naughty, naughty, naughty. Richard II later legitimised these children, however, and they became known as the Beaufort line. Remember that name.
Boo, hiss.
So, Henry Bolingbroke was banished, Richard was off fighting wars in Ireland, and Edmund was sitting with his family in York. John of Gaunt lasted roughly a year after the exile of his son before dying on the 3rd of February 1399, aged 58. After his death, Richard II, who was still a little bit peeved at his cousin Henry, disinherited him from the Duchy of Lancaster and tried to appropriate all of his property to the crown. Mm-hmm. So he tried to take it away and give it to the crown.
Yeah.
Henry was less than impressed by this and made the potentially fatal decision to return to England.
Yeah, considering he'd been banished on pain of death.
Yeah, he thought, you know what, screw that, I'm coming back.
Yep.
This dude has some bollocks.
Yep.
When he returned, he was telling anybody and everybody that he was only back to mourn his father and reclaim his lands, and had no pretence to the crown whatsoever. No, sir, not me, absolutely not.
Yep.
He then promptly started up a military campaign to confiscate lands from the opposition, and in the process destroyed much of Cheshire.
What did Cheshire ever do to him?
Eh?
Well, they probably did something to him, but, still.
Poor Cheshire.
Yeah.
He quickly amassed a lot of support and was declared King Henry IV.
This is the guy that wasn't there to be king.
Obviously, not him.
No.
Poor Richard II was imprisoned and later died under, quotations, mysterious circumstances.
Dun, dun, dun.
And his heir, Edmund Mortimer, was passed over in favour of Henry IV and his descendants. Henry also forbid the Beaufort line, remember, from ever making a claim to the throne. Forbid.
Yeah.
Ever to make a claim to the throne.
Yep.
Beaufort.
Remember
Forbidden.
that.
Remember.
So, we'll quickly whiz through the next 30 to 40 years. Henry IV had a couple of plots against him, we can say, including one from Mortimer Glendower, remember those guys? And a certain Henry Hotspur Percy, who, is, as Shakespeare proclaimed him as a young Mars. He was such a warrior, and he was quite impressive, but he was killed. He later died from a disease that has been guessed to be either leprosy or eczema, and his son...
They are very different diseases.
Well, no one really quite knew. They just knew that he itched a lot. And he died fantasising that he was in Jerusalem.
Yeah, but one of them makes you lose limbs. The other gives you, a bit of a rash.
Yeah. Either way, he died.
Fair enough.
And his shoes were filled by my bae, Henry V, who is like my favourite British warrior king. Him of Agincourt fame. Henry V sadly died, aged around 34, of dysentery in 1422, just before he could be crowned King of France.
Died of the shits.
Yes, unfortunately. His son then took over the throne aged 9 months, Henry VI.
Not entirely sure how effective he would have been.
He wasn't. I mean, even as he got older, he wasn't. The general gist of Henry VI's reign is he wasn't.
Just he wasn't.
He wasn't. He couldn't even.
Wow, he couldn't even.
No. Now, I have mixed feelings about his reign too.
Shocking.
He had big shoes to fill, in fairness. Henry V was the most popular British king ever at this point. I mean, he'd, outshone Alfred the Great. He had won so many territories back from French rule, even being named as heir to the French throne, instead of the actual Dauphin, Charles. Dauphin meaning heir to the throne, or also Dolphin. Oddly enough. Yeah, why not? He was a legend in his own time, let alone after his death. Henry VI, however, was so young that he had to have regents helping him in the form of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, and a council of others. Then there was a slight upset in the form of a young French peasant girl from Domremy called Joan of Arc. Maybe you've heard of her.
Slightly. You know, the 14-year-old who said that God was speaking to her to lead the French army.
Yeah, and she led them to victory over the English, and all of the hard-won territory, aside from the port of Calais, that his father had worked so hard for, Henry VI lost. It was returned to the French, and Dauphin was made King Charles. It was the end of the 100 Years' War between England and France, but the English, surprise, surprise, were not happy. Henry VI himself was a very pious young man. He was intellectual when it came to art and other learning, but not an effective leader. He was actually described as more suited to be a monk than a king. He also suffered from mental breakdowns, possibly as a form of depression, and some theories are that it was a form of early onset dementia such as Alzheimer's, which can occur in the very young. Humphrey became very unpopular due to the French defeats, and he and his councillors were blamed for manipulating the weak and feeble-minded king. His wife, Eleanor Cobham, not particularly popular herself, it must be said, was arrested on charges of sorcery and heresy. She died. Surprise, surprise. Humphrey retired himself from public life, and he later died of a suspected stroke, although people did also suggest poison, 3 days after being arrested himself for treason in February 1447. Richard, the 3rd Duke of York and grandson of Edmund through the paternal line, and Lionel through the maternal line, became regent, and the House of York gained power over the House of Lancaster. So, that's how the situation arose. So the chessboard is set, but who exactly are the players?
Well, whilst the War of the Roses were technically York versus Lancaster, there were other families involved. Not least of all was the House of Neville, the Earls of Warwick. Richard of York had married into that family when he wed Cecily Neville, but it was his brother Richard Neville, the 16th and last Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker, who was the star of the family.
In fairness, yeah.
He and his wife, also called Cecily, slightly odd, had 2 daughters, Isabel and Anne Neville. Now, going back to that Beaufort line that I told you not to forget, they had ticked along nicely until Margaret Beaufort, granddaughter of John of Gaunt, arrived. She was a very pious woman. She believed that her family had a legitimate claim to the throne.
Yeah, despite technically being bastards and being forbidden to try for it by Henry IV, but, hey, who cares about that, right?
Yeah.
Sorry.
This is Margaret Beaufort. She's
probably, on our list of favourite to least favourite historical figures, she's probably right down there with Oliver Cromwell.
Oh, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
But we shall discuss Margaret Beaufort at a later date.
If we must.
Yes, but just slightly we have to discuss her being who she ends up bearing in childbirth.
In fairness.
Yep. So she was married at age 12 to a Welsh lord, Edmund Tudor.
Who was the half-brother, or the half-nephew, of Henry VI through Owen Tudor.
Yeah. And together they had a son, Henry Tudor.
That sounds familiar.
I'd say remember the name, but you're very unlikely to forget it.
Yeah.
Then there were the Woodvilles, also known as the Rivers, who were descended through the Plantagenet line and very much deserved the weed analogy.
Indeed.
Mostly there was Elizabeth Woodville, her mother, Jacquetta, and her brother, Anthony. There were others, but they were probably the main 3 of the first generation. Henry VI had himself a wife, Margaret of Anjou, who was nicknamed the She-Wolf of France, due to her strong and warlike temperament, which at the time meant she wasn't very popular. Which we have discussed recently, that if a woman in history is quite strong, they're known as a she-wolf.
Exactly, which, to be honest with you, isn't a bad thing. I mean, she-wolves, they're pretty badass.
Yeah, I know, because I remember from the podcast we did a couple of weeks ago, when we did Castle Rising,
Yeah,
Isabel was a she-wolf.
exactly.
Strong women become she-wolves. You shall be a she-wolf one day, my friend.
Thank you. I think you shall be a lioness. Or no, you shall be a honey badger.
Ah,
Even,
Hufflepuff.
yeah, even the police hide on top of their cars from honey badgers.
Are they clumsy?
No.
Then we need to...
They are
I think I'm
ruthless.
probably more a dodo bird.
Probably, yeah. You want to make friends with everybody and then inevitably get shot.
Yeah.
Honey badgers are like cute and furry, but I will cut you. So yeah, you're not a honey badger.
No, I'm not. Aw, poor me.
You're cute and furry, but I will cut myself.
Yeah,
By accident. Yeah.
Yeah, if you
Slice
know
it
of a
away.
clumsy animal that kind of tries to be badass but then inevitably hurts themselves, let us know, because that is my spirit animal. So, going back to the podcast, Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou had a son, Edward, Prince of Wales, and together with Margaret Beaufort made up the Lancastrian side. On the Yorkers' side were Richard and Cecily and their sons, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, Edward, Earl of March, George and Richard, and the Woodvilles later on. The sigil of the House of Lancaster was a red rose, and the House of York had a white rose, hence the War of the Roses.
Woo.
And it was also it has also been known as the Cousins' War, because they were all basically related. Seriously, check out a family tree of them.
Yeah.
I mean, it hurts the brain as much as Game of Thrones if you were to do a family tree.
Yeah, and probably as much interrelation and family relation and what's called consanguination of like bloodlines marrying each other. It's tangled. So
Yeah, I'm
tangled.
surprised some didn't have more extra toes and fingers.
They probably did, but like they didn't really broadcast it.
No.
So, but because the main problem is a lot of the names are all really similar,
They are.
aren't they?
That's
So
probably why they did it, because they're like, I don't know, if you're going to be alright. If we have 5 Johns, at least one of them will be alright.
yeah, at least one of them is going to survive. So, yeah.
So, how did the big conflict begin?
Yeah.
Well, tension had been high for a while between York and Lancaster, as Richard of York, being regent, gave him power over the king and the kingdom. So he was basically king in all but name. So he decided he should try for that too.
Fair enough.
Henry VI was seen as weak and ineffectual. His wife was despised, and their son was seen as brutish and cruel.
Not really good indictments.
Not massively, no. York was capable and handsome. His family was strong. He had strapping sons with a power of their own, and was clearly the better choice.
Clearly.
Plus, he had the backing of arguably the most powerful and wealthy man in the kingdom behind him, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. I feel like we should have some sort of epic music or fanfare whenever we say his name.
Yeah, agreed. Sort of, yeah.
I like it.
You'll see why I say sort of a little later.
Okay.
So began the War of the Roses, a set of essentially tit-for-tat battles that raged over the course of the next 40 years and saw the throne change hands no less than 6 times before it was all over.
Wow.
And even then, it wasn't quite over. So, we've set the stage, we've named the players, now let the games begin.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's going to get a little bit confusing, as I said, with some of the names, so we've decided to refer to some of them as follows. So, Richard, Duke of York, we're going to call York, Richard Neville as Warwick, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester as Gloucester. Even though he later becomes a king, spoilers, we'll still call him Gloucester.
Okay.
We'll call Edward, Prince of Wales, Wales, to separate him from Edward, who becomes Edward IV. Again, spoiler. And the 2 Margarets as Beaufort and Anjou, respectively. In 1454, Henry VI had one of his episodes, and York, known then as Protector of the Realm, took the chance to weaken the king and his she-wolf further by dismissing some of her advisors. She wasn't particularly happy about this.
Shock.
When Henry then recovered a few months later, the decision was taken to dismiss York. He joined with Warwick, and together they amassed a force, and Henry and Anjou did likewise. The wars officially kicked off on the 22nd of May, 1455, with the First Battle of St Albans, which was a victory for the Yorkist forces, and York was reappointed as Protector of the Realm. This, again, didn't last long, however, as Anjou kept stirring hatred towards him, and he was eventually dismissed again and excluded from royal council.
Things died down for a couple of years, But as any tactician will tell you, quiet time is a good time to build an army.
Mm-hmm.
And that's exactly what the two sides did. Then, on the 23rd of September, 1459, they met again when the Yorkists won the Battle of Blawhealth.
Lancaster then equalised at Ludford Bridge, kind of like a football match, but not quite. On the 12th of October 1459, and Anjou declared the Yorkist property and lands forfeit, and York himself fled to Ireland. His forces carried on, however, and on the 10th of July 1460, the Yorkists won and captured Henry VI at the Battle of Northampton. Following the battle, Warwick ordered the death of all the prisoners.
Whoa.
So that was like taking out a big chunk of the threat all in one fell blow. This time it was Anjou's turn to flee, and she went to Wales.
On the 10th of October 1460, with the immediate threat now vanquished and Henry in the custody of Warwick and his men, York returned to England and was declared heir to the throne.
Woo!
In the meantime, Anjou was busy raising a new army in Wales.
Ooh.
Then, on the 30th of December 1460 in Wakefield, Yorkshire, the Lancastrians won a resounding victory. York and his men were safely fortified in Sandal Castle, while the Lancastrian army was camped 9 miles away at Pontefract. He sent word to his son, Edward, for reinforcements, but shit went down before he could respond.
Yep.
Nobody is quite sure why, whether it was because of the feint of some Lancastrian forces displaying false colours, or a segment of their army advancing, making York think that they had fewer troops than they actually did. But whatever the reason, he decided to lead a sortie out of the castle after the Lancastrians.
He turpined.
Yes, he very much turpined. They were quickly outnumbered, and both York and his son, Edmund, Earl of Rutland, were killed. But this was not the end.
Not at all. Because then his son, Edward, took over, and he led the Yorkists to victory on the 2nd of February 1461 at the Battle of Mortimer Cross. So this was a couple of months after losing his father and his older brother. So he needed to kick some ass.
And he did.
Things then picked up pace as a victory pendulum swung between the two sides again after a Lancastrian victory at the second Battle of St Albans on the 17th of February, where Henry VI was finally rescued. The Yorkists had won the support of many of the people in the capital, however, and on the 4th of March 1461, Edward was proclaimed King Edward IV in London.
I love him.
Yes, you do. It's really quite disturbing.
No, you say disturbing. I say watch the White Queen and see Max Irons as Edward IV.
In fairness, yeah, the handsome acting genetics run strong in that family.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you that. He then made his kingship, shall we say, official with a victory at the Battle of Towton just 5 days later.
Now, the Battle of Towton.
If you know anything about history and the Wars of the Roses in Britain, the Battle of Towton it's one of those. It's like, ooh.
Yeah.
It has become to be known as the bloodiest battle on English soil, with about 8,000 Yorkist casualties and around 20,000 Lancastrians. So we can say it's a resounding victory for York here.
Yes.
Over 50,000 soldiers slogged it out for hours amidst a snowstorm. The Yorkist forces were heavily outnumbered as they were still waiting on reinforcements from the Duke of Norfolk. However, in an act of what can only be called genius, Lord Fauconberg, the first Earl of Kent, ordered his Yorkist archers to use the strong winds to their advantage and increase the range of their shots, meaning that they could fire further to the Lancastrian forces while still being out of range of the Lancastrian arrows. This caused the Lancastrians to abandon their positions, and it forced them to engage in hand-to-hand combat, where technically they should have won because they outnumbered them. However, your boy, Norfolk, and his man, he then joined, and they bolstered the Yorkist forces, which then caused them to rout their foes, basically chasing after them, giving them one final push. That's what routing means. This caused the Lancastrians to flee, either trampling each other in the chaos or causing them to head to the rivers surrounding the field, where they subsequently drowned. Legend has it that the rivers ran red with blood for days. Prisoners were executed, the dead were looted by the locals, and bodies were dumped in mass graves due to the sheer numbers of dead.
Now, we won't discuss this at length because obviously we don't do politics here, but Towton ended on the 29th of March, which is subsequently the day that England are leaving the European Union.
Hashtag foreshadowing.
We shall not get into that any further, but it is quite an interesting coincidence.
Although, considering Enoch Powell's Rivers of Blood speech.
Yep.
Yep.
So, back to the past.
Yes.
Which we should learn from.
Yes.
Henry, however, escaped capture by fleeing with his family up to Scotland, where he remained until the 24th of June 1465, when he was finally taken prisoner and sent to the Tower of London, leaving Anjou and their son, Wales, to flee to France.
Yeah.
Everything seemed to be ticking along quite nicely for a while. Edward was king, his surviving brothers were named George, Duke of Clarence, and Richard, Duke of Gloucester, respectively. However, things weren't all rosy. See, Edward made the mistake of falling in love, and they fell in love.
Kings don't have that luxury, though.
He does. Warwick had been busy trying to agree a peace treaty with France. It had culminated in an arranged marriage between Edward and Princess Bona, the niece of King Louis XI.
Mm-hmm.
Edward, however, had other plans, and in September 1464 he revealed to a rather pissed-off Warwick that he was already married to a certain Elizabeth Woodville in March of that same year.
This being the Elizabeth Woodville who was previously married to a Mr. Grey, or Lord Grey, who was previously a Lancastrian.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
She'd switched sides somewhat.
Yes, but to be fair, by the sounds of it, how he is described, looking at Edward, you probably would.
I mean...
Well, you would.
Yeah. Edward hadn't told anybody about this whole affair and had kept it completely secret until Warwick pressed him about the marriage to Bona. This put Warwick in a bad light, as it made it seem as though he had fallen false with France, making them believe that Edward was up for the marriage when all this time he had already wed.
That's not a good thing. If you're trying to create an alliance, the last thing you want to be doing is for France to turn around and go, well, you were creating an alliance with us, but, like, what are we getting out of it? Because he's already married, so you lied.
But now they had been outed, Elizabeth was officially crowned queen, and her family slowly but surely claimed a lot of the more powerful positions in court.
Like we said, weeds.
Yep. This upset Warwick, obviously, but he was still in favour at the royal court. He was then sent over to France to try and negotiate Treaty Mark II.
Yep.
This time proposing a marriage between Edward's sister, Margaret, another one,
Yep.
and the French.
Yeah. But meanwhile...
Elizabeth's father, Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, was working at the same time to marry Margaret to the
Burgundians, dear?
Thank you! To cement an alliance there.
Sorry, I just love the fact that you can't word, so you just blow a raspberry.
I do that all the time. Seriously, when I was trying to teach people, like, I'd be in the middle of a lesson and I'd go, oh, pfft, and they'd be like, sorry, and I'm like, that's just what I do when my brain has a fart, my mouth makes a noise.
Okay, well, after your random oral expulsion, should we continue? We may need a moment. We'll be back in a sec. Oh, the wonders of editing.
No, do not edit. We're only human. Oh dear, right.
Right, yes, back to it.
I'm okay.
Are you though?
Yes. Right. So,
Burgundy, yeah.
yeah, he might, so Richard Woodville, Rivers, might have been slightly biased as his family hailed from Burgundy.
Yeah.
So he had quite a reason to try and marry Edward's sister.
Yeah.
To someone
From Burgundy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Edward then signed a secret treaty. God, he's good at keeping secrets, isn't he, our Edward? That October with Burgundy, again leaving Warwick looking like he'd been lying to the French all along.
Once again, le oeuf dans le visage. Egg on his face.
Warwick's brother, George... This podcast is going to be amazing.
Oh, wow, I'm so sorry.
Warwick's brother, George Neville, was dismissed from his position as Chancellor, and Edward vetoed a proposed marriage between his brother, Clarence, and Warwick's daughter, Isabel. Warwick was now seeing his power being diminished greatly in favour of the Woodvilles, and he was pissed.
So, he did what any self-respecting kingmaker would do. He switched sides.
Uh-huh.
In 1470, he fled to France, along with Clarence, who had married Isabel anyway. So a big middle finger up to Edward, where he joined forces with Anjou, another middle finger up to Edward, marrying his other daughter, Anne, to her son, Wales. And there comes a third finger. Not that we have a third finger, but, you know, with all this intermarrying, they might do.
Yeah, they're from Wisbeach.
In joke there. Together they then returned to England in October 1470 and succeeded in uprooting Edward and restoring Henry to the throne. Edward actually was captured by Warwick at this point and was holed up in what is now Caesar's Tower in Warwick Castle, where apparently he was a bit of a dick, and he used to have big feasts and parties and everything on Warwick's dime. So he used to get Warwick to spend all this money.
The more I learn about Edward IV, the more I love him. Yeah. He's so cool.
Anjou's son, Henry, Anjou and Warwick joined forces with Beaufort and her second husband, because Edmund Tudor was long dead by this point. Actually, no, he was her third or fourth. No, he was her fourth husband.
Because technically she got married when she was 3 years old.
Yeah, Edmund was her second husband.
But like we said, we'll do more Margaret Beaufort later.
So she, at this point, was married to Thomas Stanley. And Stanley and Beaufort joined with Warwick and Anjou, and Beaufort's son, Henry Tudor, was named as successor to Lancastrian throne.
Your sneezes are hilarious.
On the 14th of March, 1471, Edward escaped, and he fled with Gloucester and his brother-in-law, Anthony Woodville, to France, via King's Lynn.
Hey! Which is where we live, if you wonder why we're doing the shouting.
Yes.
Tiny little town, gets all of the... We were up there. It was called Bishop's Lynn at this point.
Yeah, it wasn't until his grandson... Yeah, it wasn't until his grandson came to the throne. That,
Henry VIII.
Yeah, Henry VIII, that it became King's Lynn.
But it was Bishop's Lynn at this point.
Yeah. There's a theme here. Flee, get an army, make the other guy flee. They get an army, flee again, so on and so forth. It's like a game of royal tennis.
It is.
Yeah. It's basically... It is like Game of Thrones. Pretty much every family is trying to fight for the throne, and it passes hands about 4 or 5 times before someone does finally get it.
Yeah, but a lot of people had to die for these families to, be pissed at each other.
Yeah. I mean, nowadays when we have a family argument, it's mostly on the down low, and a couple of people don't talk to each other and block each other on Facebook. We don't start wars.
No.
No.
I could.
I feel that. Anyway, when he did come back, he engaged with Warwick's forces in open battle at Barnet on the 14th of April, 1471, and he won.
Yay!
Warwick, the kingmaker, was dead. He made the mistake of letting his horse go and saying he would stand with his men, thereby not giving himself an out.
So he didn't say, my horse, my kingdom for a horse.
No, and oddly enough, neither did Richard. Anyway, Anjou and Wales were meanwhile leading a second force south towards the Welsh border, trying to get to safety away from the oncoming Yorkist forces, because they'd found out what had happened to Warwick. Due to heavy rains, however, they couldn't cross the river at the border because it flooded.
Hashtag British weather.
Yep. And the enemy caught up to them at Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, and Wales was killed. Anjou and Anne Neville, Warwick's daughter and now Wales's widow, were forced to take sanctuary, but the Yorkist forces burst in and captured them, completely going against the ancient rule of sanctuary.
Yeah.
And by ancient, probably about 1,000 years it's been going on, roughly, give or take.
And by rule we mean if you take sanctuary in an abbey or in a church, then you're supposed to be safe. Nobody can get you, you can't be imprisoned, you're just there, but that means you can't leave either.
Yeah, the second you step foot outside that church, all bets are off.
Yeah.
But yeah, as long as you're on that consecrated ground, you can't be taken. But they burst in and they caught them. Edward was once again king, but he couldn't take any chances. Henry VI was returned to the Tower, but at some point between the 21st and 22nd of May 1471 he was murdered, either directly by or on the orders of Edward.
Yeah, in The White Queen it's depicted as Edward and Richard, isn't it?
Edward, Richard and Clarence.
And George, the three of them, yeah.
Yeah,
the pillow.
We're not 100% sure how,
No.
who, we roughly know when, but yeah, he died. So Clarence then returned to his brother's favour for a while, but he couldn't keep his mouth shut.
Bit of an arse.
Massively. We'll come back to that later, but suffice it to say he's now out of the picture as well.
Mm-hmm.
So Warwick, Henry, Anjou, Clarence, all gone.
All deaded.
The Lancastrian forces were, well and truly, defeated!
But not for long!
Yay!
After years of feasting, drinking, and whoring at the top,
As a king does.
Edward IV died. We just have a moment of silence for Edward IV, please.
I adore you.
Thank you. And his son, Edward, became King Edward V, and everybody lived happily ever after.
Try again.
Oh yeah, my bad. Edward was supposed to be crowned King Edward V, but because he was only a young lad, His uncle, Gloucester, was to be Lord Protector and basically rule as regent along with the council of trusted advisors until Edward came of age.
Mm-hmm.
This was done on, that was also Edward the Fourth. That's what he wanted to happen. He wanted Gloucester to take over as Protector until Edward the Fifth came of age.
Because Gloucester was his loyal and faithful brother who'd stuck with him through it all, unlike Clarence.
Yeah, so if only Richard had listened. If you'd listened to our previous podcasts, you'll know what happened next. Young Edward was taken into Gloucester's custody, and Anthony Woodville, who had previously been his guardian, was executed by Gloucester for treason. He starts becoming a bit of an arsehole.
What?
Edward V was placed in the Tower of London, where he was awaiting his coronation, as kings did, because the Tower of London wasn't just somewhere you went to be executed.
Oh no, it was actually a castle, wasn't it? It was built by William the Conqueror.
Yeah. His mother, Elizabeth, fled with his brothers and sisters to Westminster Abbey, and she then claimed sanctuary.
Because we know that's sacrosanct.
But Gloucester actually listened to it. Like, she was in sanctuary for quite a while.
In fairness, he was a good guy like that.
Yeah, Gloucester had persuaded her to release Edward's younger brother, Richard, into his custody as well, so that he could join his brother in the tower and keep him company, and also attend his coronation.
Yeah, because he's his brother, and they're kids.
Yeah. Do you know what good old Richard did? Or what we don't know what he did, but do you know what happened next after he killed their uncle for literally no reason? And do you know what he did?
Whoa, he killed him for treason. They were armed. They were going there armed.
Yes, and I think maybe it's because they knew what was going to happen. Because after these two young, innocent little boys were sent to the tower, they were never seen again.
Maybe.
Possibly, we don't know. But they weren't ever seen again. There are theories that Richard wasn't the real Richard that was sent, and he was sent over to Burgundy in France to be with some relatives until he could come back, and lots of that then led to
Stuff we'll talk about later.
Yeah, uprisings for Henry VII. But yeah, Richard put these two little boys into the tower and they were never seen again.
Yeah.
What we do know is that in 1483, the Woodville children were declared illegitimate, and that meant that they couldn't succeed to the throne. So Gloucester took over and became King Richard III.
Yeah. For good or ill, whatever his part in it, those are the facts. That's what we know. That's what happened. Yeah. Elizabeth, meanwhile, worked behind the scenes from Sanctuary. At this point, she'd lost her husband, her father, her brother, maybe her two sons, but she still had a chance. She allied herself with the Lancastrians by arranging marriage through Beaufort of her daughter, also called Elizabeth, because that's not confusing enough, and Henry Tudor. Gloucester, meanwhile, had married the widowed Anne Neville, and they had a son, Edward. Again, confusing, guys.
Yeah, but Anne was properly in love with Richard. This was another marriage for love.
To be fair, they'd grown up together because Richard was one of Warwick's wards, so they'd grown up together. Anyway, young Edward had died, and hot on his heels, Anne died too. He didn't really have time to grieve, however, as on the 7th of August 1485, Henry Tudor landed from France in Milford Haven in Wales with a force made up mostly of mercenaries and troops given him by his mother and her allies and Louis of France. His stepfather, Thomas Stanley, and his step-uncle, William Stanley, both had armies on either side of the Wars of the Roses. So no matter what happened, they would always be on the winning side. So William Stanley and his men marched with Henry, and Thomas was meant to march with Gloucester, but it didn't quite work out that way. Gloucester rode out to meet the young upstart and quash the threat to his throne, and they met on the 22nd of August 1485 at Bosworth Field, Leicestershire, for the final battle of the Wars of the Roses. The battle was slowly going in Gloucester's favour, but neither of the Stanley brothers had joined the fighting yet, instead watching from the sidelines to see who was winning. At the last moment, they declared for Henry Tudor, and this turned the tide of battle in his favour. Gloucester became the last English king to die in battle, and Tudor became King Henry VII, married Elizabeth of York, the daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and forever united the two houses, creating a single joint symbol, the Tudor Rose.
There were a couple of rebellions from people still loyal to the Yorkist cause, but Tudor put those down pretty quickly. Like we said before, there were even people claiming to be the two princes in the tower, Edward V and Richard. One of these was captured and the other was executed. Also executed was the 24-year-old Edward, Earl of Warwick, the son of Clarence and Elizabeth Neville, and his sister Margaret was married off on Henry's orders.
Sorry, Isabel Neville.
What did I say?
You said Elizabeth.
Did I?
Yeah, I think you're on autopilot from Elizabeth York.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I do apologise. Thank you for correcting me. So then he married off... Margaret, his sister, was married off on Henry's orders. So the threats were all but over. But his rule was secure, and despite hiccups of plague, sweating sickness, and the death of his firstborn son Arthur, Henry VII's legacy lived on through both the Tudor and Stuart eras.
Yeah, because though the Tudors were technically his direct succession descendants, his daughter Margaret married James IV of Scotland, so the Stuarts were then his descendants as well. They were his great-grandchildren, so on as well. So he had two eras, both of which came to a childless end. Just putting that out there.
Mm-hmm.
Not that I'm, gloating or anything, because my bae Richard was killed and humiliated, and then Henry's lines ended.
Richard did kill his two nephews in the tower.
Allegedly. We will never know, unfortunately, because their bodies will not be exhumed for testing. Or the bodies that were found. We don't know
The bones of two children of the same age, of the same gender, were found at the bottom of the stairs in the place where they had gone missing.
Found during the rule of one of Henry's descendants. And they were buried so quickly, there was no proper testing done on them. All we know is that they were children, they were male, that was it. They could have been anybody. We don't 100% know, and we won't 100% know because our current monarchy won't allow us to exhume them. I'm sure they have their own reasons.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to think there's like a big book of monarchical secrets that are just passed down.
You're in slight denial when it comes to the princes in the tower, though, Carrie.
I am in slight denial because I don't think that, even though he had something to gain, I think Richard had far, far more to lose from killing them. He was far too loyal to his brothers, and it wouldn't have made sense. And at the end, as we discussed in the Richard podcast, in the Battle of Bosworth, if he had killed the princes in the tower, why were the people displaying the sigil of his brother, the sun in splendour? There's archaeological evidence found of them within his personal retinue fighting for him. So why would that have been there if he'd have done it? It's like it would be like me killing your children and then, like, your sister still fighting for me. It wouldn't make sense.
Mary would, though.
Yeah, Mary would, but she has her reasons. # stairs.
Oh my god. So yeah, that is the Wars of the Roses. It sounds like it's very complicated, but if you break it down, it's just, a few families being pissed at each other for a while until the Tudors come along and say, stop now.
Yeah, basically, if you just boil it down to York and Lancaster, with Warwick kind of swinging in between, then it's really, really simple. When you start adding in all the other families as well, it gets Game of Thrones overcomplicated.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to do family trees and lineages and spider graphs just to try and get them all.
And pie charts. Everyone needs a good pie chart.
Yeah. Invented by Florence Nightingale.
Awesome.
Sorry, random side fact. So, ridiculous death, Emily.
Yes, well, I don't necessarily agree with this ridiculous death, and I know that you don't
same.
really either. However, whenever I was trying to find a ridiculous death from this era, and even from the Wars of the Roses, this one kept coming up.
Yes.
It is a very popular death where people think it was funny, it was ridiculous, it was stupid.
But it wasn't. It was a big up yours to Edward and Elizabeth.
Yeah, so our ridiculous death this evening goes to George, the Duke of Clarence.
Which is why we didn't talk about him earlier.
Yeah, he, like we said, he was born, just to give you a little brief overview of before our death, because we focus on them.
Yeah.
He was born in 1449. He was George Plantagenet, the Duke of Clarence, was brother of Edward IV. After the king had refused permission for the Duke to marry Isabel, George began to plot against him. Edward, wise with brother's treachery, had the Duke arrested and charged with treason. He was brought before Parliament and accused of preparing a rebellion.
Yep.
Both Houses of Parliament passed a bill approving his execution at the Tower of London. There were lots of ways that he could have died. Popular execution methods at the time included hanging, drawing, quartering, as well as beheadings and burnings at the stake.
Yep.
But George was a royal. and which is probably why he was allowed to choose the manner of his death. And also possibly not just because he was a royal, Edward was like, would let him choose. Like, he was like, you've plotted against me, you need to die, but you can decide how.
Yeah, it's like, you've called my wife a witch in public, but I'm going to give you this.
If it was me, I'd want something quick.
Yeah, I would too. Like, beheading, over and done with.
I'd like Anne Boleyn style beheading, where Henry got the guy from France with the really sharp sword that did it when she weren't looking.
Yeah, sure, quick.
Yeah.
But no.
His choice was somewhat unusual. He chose to be drowned in a vat of Elizabeth Woodville's favourite wine.
Malmsey wine, wasn't it?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, if you gotta go.
But it did mean that an entire vat of her favourite wine was then spoiled for her.
Yeah, and it was a massive middle finger up to Edward and Elizabeth. You know, like, you're gonna kill me?
Yeah.
This is your favourite thing? It's almost like, you know, Ben drowning in Rioja.
Yeah, or coffee. I like coffee.
He's my husband.
Yeah, but, you know, he'd probably be middle finger up more to me than to you.
Oh, yeah, to be fair. I mean, you're drinking Rioja now. You like Rioja.
I do.
But yeah, so I don't particularly think that's I guess it's unusual because he chose quite a, you know what, if this is the one last thing I can do, I'm going to piss you off.
Yeah, it's like an ironic sort of.
Yeah, but I don't think it's necessarily funny, but when you Google this sort of, I've been trying to research into a ridiculous death, his came up on the list time and time again. Yeah. So our ridiculous death this year does go to George. This year? This
week.
Podcast goes to George, Duke of Clarence.
Indeed. So, that's it of the War of the Roses. We will probably revisit each of the individual characters in their own podcast, kind of shine a spotlight on each of them.
Yeah.
One interesting thing, though, after his betrayals of them, there are no surviving portraits of Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, from his lifetime.
Oh, wow.
He was scratched from history. The only surviving portrait we have is a posthumous one. So, don't piss off the king.
No.
Indeed. And don't send your horse away. I mean, rookie error. Yeah. Anyway, we're off to drink our own wine.
We are.
Not Malmsey. And
No.
minus Dead Princess. Hopefully. And we shall speak to you next Tuesday.
Yep, as always, follow us, Instagram, Twitter, WordPress, @Tarbers History, and on Facebook. It's easy, just one handle. Review, comment, like, subscribe. We love you. Speak to you next week.